Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Snook. How are you today? So today we're going to continue talking about Chapter 4, Section 1, and we're going to move from talking about mining today, and we're going to move into talking about cattle ranching. Now you have to understand that in the years after the Civil War, many Americans wanted to reinvent themselves. They wanted to escape, all those terrible memories of the war, of the fact that their loved ones died, or that they killed people during the war, or that their homes were destroyed and that they perhaps made mistakes, that, perhaps they were regretful. And so they want to create this fresh start. So we talked last time a lot about how young men moved out west and hoped to get rich quick. There was no lottery back then, and they hoped that this would be the answer. And most men, we said, unless they worked for giant corporations, they didn't get rich. And ultimately, there were all these gold strikes throughout American history, going all the way back into the 1800s. Most people think that, the California gold rush in 49 was the first one, but that's simply not the case. There was one gold rush after another. But as gold and silver continually were found, it brought people west. And more importantly, it led to, people moving out there, which eventually led to the creation of new states. And as the railroad were created, it led to goods being sold across the country. It led to more travel. It led to more trade. So today we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the cowboy. And our goal is to really understand, why would a man want to become a rancher? What would make him want to move west and try to learn about horses and to try to take care of cattle and to basically live a very lonely life in a sense, since he would be away from his family for large portions of the year as he was on a long drive, taking the cattle from perhaps Texas or wherever he lived to Dodge City or Abilene in Kansas so that it could catch the railroad to go back to Chicago for slaughter. What would make a man want to do this? And so we'll be talking a little bit today about the rise of the cattle kingdom, so why there was such demand for beef in America, and what life was like for a cowboy in terms of the challenges he faced and the conditions that he lived with on a daily basis. And then into our next lesson, over the next few days, we'll start to talk about who some of the famous cowboys were, who some of the famous sheriffs and outlaws were, what ultimately led to the end of the cattle kingdom, so why some people decided not to be cowboys anymore and how they actually eventually ended up working in factories, and just some of the problems with life out west. One of the themes we want to touch on today is that if you've ever seen a Western, which you may have, you may not have, but a lot of movies, which are considered Westerns, which is a whole other genre, a whole other topic, just like horror movies or romance or drama or comedy, a lot of Westerns are full of mythology, meaning they always tell a certain story about someone who is the lone cowboy, the gunslinger, the good guy, so to speak. Sometimes he has a white horse, or he wears all white. He goes against the outlaws who are always robbing the stagecoach and the bank. He always carries a loaded gun. He's always ready to fight. And of course, there's always Native Americans around who are always thought of in a very stereotypical fashion. And he always has to kill the Indians and save the girl, who of course, couldn't possibly do anything on her own. So these are all stereotypes, which are often, part of these perpetual myths, which have been created in magazines, in, books, and eventually in TV shows and in movies. Westerns might not be as popular today as they once were, but if you talk to your parents, you talk to your grandparents, they'll tell you that, Clint Eastwood is a legend. John Wayne is a legend for many of the Western movies that they've made. And talking to my own mom, growing up when there was only, 5 television channels, literally that's it, 5. And if you wanted to watch TV, it was live. It was black and white. And she would tell you that she watched The Lone Ranger because that's literally all that was on. And on the other station, it might have been the news at that time. So Westerns were more of a part of your life, perhaps, than they are today, especially since you get to choose what you want to watch, if you even want to watch TV, and how you're going to watch TV. But there's all these myths about a cowboy and what his life was really like. And as you watch the video clip that I've posted today, you'll come to find out that most of those, things that we seem to think about cowboys are not true. They are just indeed myths. And the thing that I want to really mention is that cowboys usually did not get rich for their work. Most of the time, cowboys are not really fearful of attacks from Native Americans. Those were more so far and few between, unless they were isolated and on their own. They're more so worried about a stampede, that the cattle will get scared of something, that they'll take off, and that they'll end up losing some of the cattle because that's their money. And they work hard for their, they work hard basically for their income. And for the most part, they usually only make like $1 a day. So it's long, hard work with potentially, especially if they're on the drive, meaning they are moving the cattle from one part of the country to another. They're not going to get much sleep either because somebody has to stay up all night or take shifts to watch those cattle to make sure that animals don't eat them, they don't wander off, they don't get attacked, something like that. Who actually made money then out west? Well, it's going to be these big companies which are coming in, and they're going to be creating the Transcontinental Railroad so that you can ship the cattle across the country as well as other goods. And yet again, any large corporations which come in and buy up cheap farmland and sell it at over prices to people, or buy up lots of cattle. But for the most part, it's not going to be the individual cowboy. So what I'm getting at here is that the cowboy has often been what we could refer to as romanticized or mythologized, where people have made it seem like, oh, the cowboy is this hero and he's going to go off into the sunset by himself and save the day. And he is somewhat of what we refer to as a vigilante because he takes the law into his own hands. There might be a sheriff, but that sheriff isn't anywhere near. And so, he's going to save the day. And as I mentioned, save the girl, stop the outlaw, stop the bank robbery, kill all those evil Indians, right? And those are, of course, all exaggerated stereotypes and myths that have really been created in magazines to entertain people, in comics, in books, and eventually were created into TV shows and movies like The Virginian. The cattle business, for the most part, was lonely because you were gone for a long period of time, but it wasn't as lonely as you thought. It's not like these men were off on their own. They're working as a team with all these other cowboys who have specific jobs, such as the trail boss who needs to really know the map and know the trail. You've got the chuck wagon cook, so somebody who's always going to be doing the cooking. So yes, they all tend to take care of the cattle and make sure they're fed and make sure they don't wander off, but they also have specific jobs or roles. They work as a team, so they're not completely isolated like one might think. And it's also not so exciting. A lot of people think that there's always going to be these attacks from bandits or from Native Americans, and neither one is true. Native Americans, for the most part, only attacked people if they were on their own individually, if they came onto their land, otherwise they kept to themselves. And, outlaws, yet again, attacks on stagecoaches or banks was yet again few and far between, but it makes for good entertainment for movies and television shows. Most of the time, cowboys were actually incredibly bored because they had nothing to do. So they would sing songs, they would recite the labels from the back of their cans of foods. It was a long, boring, hot, dirty, dusty job most of the time. So we've got some pictures here about ranchers. And ranching would really appeal to a young man if, think about it, he wants to make a name for himself, he wants to forget about his life after the Civil War, or maybe he was too young to fight during the Civil War, and especially if they were a Southerner, they may have lost their land at this point because, if they relied on slave labor to do the job, and, a lot of their land perhaps was burned, right, in Sherman's March to the Sea or something of that nature. After the war, they can't pay the taxes on their land as carpetbaggers come in, and as many, Republicans took control of the government in the South temporarily. So perhaps they can't pay the taxes, the land gets foreclosed upon, they decide to move and go out west for a fresh start. Now, many planters retained their land, remember, in the South, and then actually ended up hiring their ex-slaves as sharecroppers, but there were some people who lost their land, and so they look for a fresh start, and they go out west. And so this appealed primarily to young men who thought it was going to be exciting and glamorous and dangerous and all sorts of things like that. But in reality, it was hot, dirty, dusty, smelly, boring, somewhat lonely away from their family, and kind of monotonous in a way as far as doing the same type of duty day after day. And so they would take care of their animals. They would fatten them up, so to speak. They would usually brand the animal so somebody would know that it was part of their group. And then eventually, they would let them graze on kind of this open farmland. And when it was time, they would take them on this long drive where they would take them from wherever they were raising the cattle in Texas or wherever, to eventually to Kansas, where we saw one of the big railroad stops. Prior to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, you still at least had a railroad out to Kansas that could connect to Chicago, which was the big meat processing center, and then that cattle could then be shipped and sold back to Chicago area, New York, wherever, for steak. So ultimately, this was kind of the process that people would be going through. And if you were successful at doing it, you could keep track of your cattle, you could fatten them up. They didn't die from exhaustion, dehydration, running ragged. So if you were able to successfully drive your cattle to Kansas, sell each of them for a good price as they got shipped off, sometimes they got slaughtered right there and then the meat got shipped, sometimes they got shipped to Chicago where they were slaughtered. It just depended on your business. But it was possible to become this cattle baron, meaning someone who had all this money, and then obviously they divided it up. And so once the men got paid, as you can imagine, they kind of went crazy once they got to Dodge City or Abilene, and they partied hard, and they went to saloons, and they went to bars, they bought new clothes, they got fancy meals, they took a shower for the first time in months, and you can imagine they stank like hardcore. And then they basically would put away the rest of the money for their family and for the winter, and then they would go back home and kind of do the whole thing again the next year. And in the meantime, just kind of start to raise a whole new herd of cattle. But when you're thinking about how much money they really make, it's only usually about $1 a day as it's kind of averaged out. Now, I've been mentioning these cattle drives, and gotta move my screen down here just a second. There we go. As I've been mentioning these cattle drives or these trails, you have to understand that a lot of them started in Texas, because Texas is obviously a huge state. It's vast, it's open land, and a lot of these longhorn cattle, which are going to be the ones that can really survive going a large amount of time without water, that's where they really lived. And so people would, raise them in Texas, and then eventually they would drive them on some of the famous trails like the Chisholm Trail over to Dodge City or Abilene, and then eventually that's where they would be catching the train. Now, part of the reason why we have such a demand for beef at this point in time is because the war is over. And so what's going to really lead to this cattle kingdom, or the rise of the cattle kingdom, and the fact that these barons have all these money, really has to do with the fact that after the war, there were people who were wealthy. Remember I mentioned those carpetbaggers, people who saw opportunity in the war, and they're like, ooh, people in the South, they've lost all their land. Sherman's burned their house to the ground. They won't be able to pay taxes on it this year. All their slaves have left. They have no way to grow a crop. So they rushed down there and they offered the people a fair price. And they said, look, you're not going to get what you once did. Sell it to me before it gets foreclosed upon. The bank's going to take it because you can't pay your taxes. So some people sold. Some people waited till the land went to foreclosure and bought it from the bank. But we did see these carpetbaggers who went to the South, bought up land at cheap prices and got rich. And now they're living high on the hog, so to speak, and they want beef. The war is over. They want to live life to the fullest. And to them, beef is a status symbol, just like today in terms of the car you drive, the clothes you wear. It's about money. You're not eating chicken, you're not eating pork, and you're not just eating vegetables or some kind of stew for dinner. You've got steaks on the table. So there was this demand for beef to kind of show your money, your status, your wealth. Hey, I survived the war. I was on the winning side, so to speak. I've got all this money to show off. And just to kind of live life to the fullest, this mentality that life's too short, thinking of all the people who did die in the war. And so ultimately, that's one reason why we see this cattle kingdom rise. But it also has to do with the longhorn cattle. These longhorn cattle, a lot of other cattle were not able to make the long drive. But once they realized that the longhorn cattle were, and that you could, take them for days, weeks, months on end from Texas, and they'd be able to survive on little water to get all the way to Kansas, and you could still fatten them up like you're going at a slow pace. And you can still fatten them up so that you can sell them for a good price, and they weren't going to be dying from any other diseases, and they were pretty low maintenance. Once they realized that really helped to sustain this demand for beef, because now you had a breed of cattle which could be fattened up. And the other reason why we saw really the rise of this cattle kingdom has to do with the open range. The fact that even though people owned that land in Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma, they didn't put up fences or anything. They just let people basically roam throughout their land, like you can see in this picture here. And here's another goodnight loving trail. But since they just let horsemen, cowboys, cattle, roam across, that means they could really be fattened up. And you're just letting people eat off your grassland. And it was basically to everyone's mutual benefit. And so that was really what made it possible to truly have this cattle kingdom. And so here's another picture of the Texas Longhorn cattle where I've been talking about. It's got a good sense of smell. It could actually locate sources of groundwater so that it's not going to die. And it's durable, it's tough. And as I've been talking about, the life of a cowhand in particular was not the easiest life. For the most part, Americans often think that, they were the first cowboys, but that's not true. The first cowboys were known as vaqueros, and that's really just the Spanish word for cowboy. And they were the ones who really taught the Americans in Texas, because remember, Texas was originally owned by Mexico and by Spain. So it's really the Mexicans, the Spanish, who taught the Americans how to take care of cattle, how to tend to them, how to drive them, how to control them, how to get them to market for a profit. And as I mentioned, being a cowboy was a dirty job, a hot job, a boring job. It wasn't that they were afraid of danger from Indians or outlaws. It was really stampedes that, your herd would get scared of lightning or a snake and that they would run off and they would kill you or destroy some other animal and that there would go your profit. And I already mentioned that, cowboys pretty much worked for only about $1 a day once they were paid in Dodge City or Abilene. It really depended on the price of the herd and, what had been agreed upon in their contract. But ultimately, it really was not a lot of money, which is why it was difficult to truly, make a buck and get rich. It was really just the big ranches, the big corporations, which made all the profits here. And as I said, they each had a specific job. So the men in the group, one might be the chuck wagon cook, one might be the trail driver who really, keeps them going, knows where they're headed, has the map. So they each kind of have a specific job, even though and they're kind of working as a team. So it's not as isolated as people think. So yet again, that's another one of those myths of the cowboys. And I also kind of mentioned that the cow towns themselves, they were happy in a way, like in Dodge City and Abilene, that's where the trail ended. And all the cowboys would show up because, it was great business for their bars, their restaurants, their hotels, because the men would come in and get a room. They would take a bath. They would stink hardcore, as I said. They would get new clothes. They'd go out to eat. They'd buy like little trinkets and toys for their family if they did have one, or sisters and brothers. And ultimately, it was good business, but they also could be very drunk and kind of wild and crazy, and it would lead to fights. And so sometimes people didn't appreciate that, and they eventually ended up kicking out some of the people, especially in Dodge City, and made restrictions saying, we don't want you coming through our town because you are so rowdy. And there could be a lot of fights between the cowboys, just like there were a lot of fights among miners. And they'd be fighting about, their contract, how much they were supposed to be paid. They thought they deserved more. So these cow towns, definitely could be wild, could be kind of crazy. It could be a little rambunctious, so to speak. And I've already kind of mentioned Wyatt Earp, how he was one of the famous outlaws. I talked about him, I think, in the last lesson for keeping the peace. And usually there were shootouts. It was often about gold, silver, women, something of that nature. And there were sheriffs who were in town, such as Wyatt Earp, to try to keep the peace, whether it was over cattle ranching or farm rights or mining. But yet again, because their sheriff had to cover such a vast amount of distance, you did see these vigilance type committees, which would kind of take the law into their own hands. So some of that myth does have some truth to it. But in general, it was a little bit of a wild west, but a lot of that has also really been romanticized. All right, guys, that wraps it up for today. We'll finish up who are some of the famous cowboys, talk some more about the myths versus the reality, the life on the trail a little bit more, as well as the end of the cattle boom next time. Have a great day, guys. Later.